Now we're ready to address our third and final step. This is the electron transport chain. Do this in green. The electron transport chain is going to occur across the inner mitochondrial membrane. 2, 3. All right. In order for the electron transport chain to occur, just think about the name. It needs to transport electrons. Now, where are we going to get those electrons? Remember, I've been telling you about these molecules, NADH and FADH2, and those were the electrons carrier molecule. They're the ones that are carrying the electron. So what's going to happen is these electrons from NADH, for instance here, and also FADH2, these electrons are going to get transported to the electron transport chain. We're going to bring these here. We're going to bring these here. So basically our NADH and FADH2 molecules have arrived and they have all of our electrons.
So remember our analogy of NADH being like Lyft, and then FADH2 can be thought of similar to Uber. They picked up their passenger electrons at point A. Now this is their drop-off point B at the electron transport chain.
So what's going to happen is they're going to drop the electrons off at the beginning of the electron transport chain, which remember is occurring in the inner mitochondrial membrane.
When electrons are dropped off at the electron transport chain, NADH loses the H with the electron and becomes NAD, which is recycled back to glycolysis. This is happening when oxygen is around, which avoids anaerobic respiration. The electron continues to the chain.
The electron transport chain is a series of proteins. So I'm going to have a generic series of proteins here. And the electrons enter the chain to the first protein, and then they fall down to the next protein. When I say fall down, the electrons are going down. They actually release energy. It's like going down a slide. They're releasing energy as they go. Now remember, we need to harvest this energy. Our goal is to ultimately get this energy onto ATP. So as these electrons go down the chain, what happens is it takes these protons, which are on the inside of the mitochondria, and it uses the energy to pump them out against their concentration gradient. So the energy essentially is transferred from the electrons falling down the chain to these protons being pumped against their concentration gradient to what we call the intermembrane space. So it's between the outer and the inner membrane. So all these protons are accumulating now in this space as the electrons go down the chain. One protein I do want to mention in the chain is cytochrome C. And that's going to be a really critical protein that we'll be looking at later. If you have damage to cytochrome C, the effects are really detrimental. Right, so the electrons have gone down the chain, protons have been pumped against their concentration gradient to the space right here. So now all of our energy is in these protons right here. At the very end of the chain is this special protein called ATP. ATP synthase. And based on the name, synthase means to make, this protein at the end of the chain is going to make ATP. And how it does get the energy is these protons come and they actually go through ATP synthase. And when they go through ATP synthase, they release energy. It's almost like water going through a dam. So when the protons fall through the ATP synthase, they release the energy. We use that energy, or ATP synthase uses that energy to take ADP and turn it into ATP. And remember, ATP is the form of energy we ultimately want. After all this is done, approximately 34 ATP molecules will be made using the electrons off of that first original glucose molecule. Now we're almost finished. Notice we have not mentioned oxygen at all yet, and yet the original question was, why do we need to eat and breathe? So the eating, of course, with the glucose, which started this whole process, but where's the oxygen? Turns out the oxygen is right here. Oxygen is at the very end of the chain, and its role is to accept the electrons at the end of the chain. We call it the final electron acceptor. If oxygen is not there to receive the electrons at the end of the chain, the electrons won't even start going down the chain. So oxygen is absolutely critical. No oxygen, no electrons going down the chain, no protons being pumped out, which means no protons going through ATP synthase, which means no ATP. And so therefore it is critical.
An analogy I like to use is that an electron is like a small child at the top of the slide who doesn't want to go down. How might you get that child to go down? What if you put the parent at the bottom of the slide? And even better, what if the parent is holding the child's favorite treat? That will motivate the child to go down the slide. Same thing with the electrons. You drop them off at the top of the chain, but they need something to motivate them to go down. Oxygen is like the parent with the treat. Oxygen motivates the electron to go down the chain by attracting and accepting the electrons at the end of its long journey. Again, this oxygen is critical for the production of ATP in the electron transport chain.
And one final thing is the water. Notice here that we have the oxygen, we have protons, we have electrons. What's going to happen is that the oxygen with the electrons are going to combine with the protons and make H2O, or water. So now we've gone through all three steps of cellular respiration.